The harem of Topkapi Palace was a world hidden from the eyes of the city. Behind gates of iron and walls of marble, hundreds of women lived in a silence broken only by whispers and the sound of footsteps over polished stone. In one of its inner chambers sat Fatma Sultan, daughter of a dynasty, about to be prepared for her wedding. The chamber glowed with lamplight. Steam rose from bowls of scented water, carrying the heavy perfume of amber and rose. Attendants surrounded her, their faces expressionless as they carried out the rituals passed down for generations. They washed her skin until it reddened. They pulled her hair until it yielded to their braids, then soaked it with thick oils that dripped down her shoulders. Around her waist they tied a strip of red silk, pulling it until her breath caught in her chest. It was meant to symbolize purity. To her, it was a chain that reminded her she belonged to someone else now. The gown followed, layer upon layer of fabric stitched with gold thread pressed on her body until her knees shook beneath the weight. The veil fell across her face, and with it her reflection disappeared. In its place stood a bride that did not look alive. Outside the chamber, drums began to beat. The floor trembled with the march of soldiers who would escort her through the palace gates. Fatma rose slowly, every step heavy, her heart racing yet silent at once. She was not walking toward joy. She was walking toward a sentence carried out in silk and jewels. Stay with this story until the end and see how every wedding only deepened her captivity. If you want to uncover more of these hidden tragedies, subscribe to our channel. Fatma Sultan grew up surrounded by marble courtyards and gardens perfumed with jasmine. As a child, she wandered through galleries lined with silk carpets and fountains that whispered softly in the night. For her, Topkapi Palace was a paradise, a world where poetry was read aloud by tutors and music drifted through the halls. She was the daughter of the empire, watched over by servants who bowed to her presence. Every corridor seemed built to protect her. Every glance confirmed that she was precious. Then the day of her marriage was fixed. From that moment, paradise ended. She was led through the gates of the inner harem, past the chambers she had known, into a section spoken of in hushed voices. It was the place where daughters of the dynasty were made into brides. To step inside was to fall into another world. The air was heavy. The women waiting there were not gentle attendants, but hardened instructors who had served the palace for decades. Their faces carried no warmth. Their eyes searched for flaws to punish. The first lesson was weight. They dressed her in a gown layered with gold embroidery, heavier than anything she had ever worn. She was ordered to walk the length of the marble hall. Her steps faltered under the crushing fabric. She stumbled, and immediately they forced her to begin again. Again she faltered. Again she was made to walk. By the end, her legs shook violently, her breath ragged. Yet she was told to smile as if nothing pained her. When she thought the torment was finished, another trial began. Fatma was told to kneel on the cold stone floor, her back straight, her hands folded. She remained there as the hours crawled by. Each time her shoulders sagged, a sharp command cut the air. Each time her body trembled. The rod of an instructor tapped her back. By the end, she could no longer feel her legs. She had learned that a bride of the dynasty must endure without complaint. The mirror was next. She was placed before the polished glass and ordered to smile. Too soft, they said. Too sharp. Again. Again. Her lips cracked, her eyes dulled, her laughter forgotten. The girl who once composed verses in secret was gone. What stared back at her from the mirror was a mask, a hollow image trained to please. Then came the darkest lesson. In a chamber lit by a single lamp, she was laid on a bed and told to remain still. No voice, no movement, only silence. It was a rehearsal for the wedding night, and it felt like lying in a tomb. Stories whispered through the harem spoke of girls who fainted from terror during these nights. Others, unable to bear it, sought poison to escape. Fatma could do neither. She was a princess, and even death was denied her. Watching from the shadows was her mother, Kösem Sultan, the woman the empire called Mother of the Nation, inspected the training without pity. She had risen from slavery to rule, but her power demanded sacrifices, even her daughter's soul. In her eyes, this was duty. In Fatma's eyes, it was betrayal. By the time the final lesson ended, paradise was far behind her. The fountains, the gardens, the poetry were memories of another life. What remained was a girl stripped of self, a vessel sculpted by hands older and colder than her own. On the day she left that school, she carried no freedom with her, only the silence of someone who had already been buried alive. The day of the wedding arrived with all the thunder of empire. Drums shook the streets of Istanbul, their rhythm steady as a march of war. Crowds pressed against the procession route to glimpse the treasures carried from the palace treasury. Gold plates, bolts of silk, jewels piled in baskets shimmered beneath the autumn sun. They called it celebration. For Fatma, it was a burial in daylight. She was placed inside a carriage draped in crimson cloth. The gown clung to her shoulders with the weight of gold thread. Every step of the horses made her sway under the burden. Soldiers lined both sides, their boots crashing against the stone in a cadence that sounded more like a funeral dirge than a wedding march. The music that soared above the city was said to be joyous, yet to her it was a cry of mourning. She sat behind the veil and breathed in silence. At the gates of Kara Mustafa Pasha's residence, she was delivered like a prize. He stood waiting. The soldier who had fought campaigns across the empire, a man shaped by iron and blood, his eyes fixed on the carriage with the hunger of one who believed he was about to claim his greatest conquest. Ministers congratulated him, poets recited verses, and all around them the glitter of empire masked the reality of the captive bride. When night fell, Fatma was led into the bridal chamber. Lamps burned low, casting long, trembling shadows. The heavy veil was lifted and placed aside. The room grew still. Outside, guards took their stations at the doors. No one entered. No one left. What happened next was not written in court records, yet whispers escaped the walls. A chronicler named Osmanzada Taib later wrote that servants standing in the corridor heard a cry that split the silence. One described it as the sound of a woman torn apart. A guard swore he heard the crash of furniture and then another scream, followed by sudden quiet as if the voice had been smothered. In taverns, years later, an old soldier told the same story with a shudder. He said it was not the cry of shyness or fear. It was the sound of torment. Inside the chamber, Kara Mustafa approached his bride like a general advancing on a fortress. He had expected resistance, the desperate struggle of a jewel too bright to be surrendered easily. He wanted conquest. What he found instead was emptiness. Fatma lay as she had been trained in the academy, motionless, silent, her spirit absent. Her eyes stared past him. She did not plead. She did not resist. She was already gone. Frustration twisted into cruelty. He pressed harder, seeking life, seeking some proof of victory. Instead, he drove her deeper into collapse. Servants whispered that she fainted again and again, her cries breaking the night before, fading into nothing. At dawn, the door opened. Kara Mustafa stepped out, not triumphant, but grim, his face pale as if he had wrestled with a ghost rather than a bride. For Fatma, that night was a second death. In the silent academy of brides, she had lost her soul. On her wedding night, she lost her body. What rose the next morning was no longer a young woman, but a hollow vessel, prepared for the cycle that would begin again. The gown would return, the drums would thunder once more, and each time the ceremony repeated. It would not be a beginning, but another sentence carried out in silk and shadow. The morning after the wedding, life in the residence of Kara Mustafa Pasha settled into a rhythm that felt like a slow execution. Fatma Sultan walked the corridors wrapped in silk, her steps measured, her face hidden behind the mask the academy had carved for her. Day after day, she sat in chambers decorated with carpets and golden bowls. Yet the silence pressed harder than stone. Servants described her as a figure who breathed but never spoke, a bride who had left her voice behind on the night she entered the bridal chamber. Kara Mustafa Pasha soon discovered that triumph soured quickly. He had imagined marriage to the daughter of Kösem as the crowning jewel of his career. He had dreamed of a wife who would resist him, whose tears and cries would prove his dominance. Instead, he came home each night to silence. Fatma met him with empty eyes and an unyielding stillness. She was neither tender nor rebellious. She was absent. Frustration burned within him. He was a soldier who lived on conquest, who measured worth by victory. Facing a wife who offered nothing but vacancy drove him to anger. He shouted, struck, demanded. Fatma endured it all without breaking the mask. Each blow only widened the gulf between them. He grew harsher. She grew colder. The marriage became a battlefield without sound, a war fought in silence that neither could win. Whispers spread among the servants. They spoke of muffled cries behind locked doors, of nights when Fatma fainted and attendants were called to revive her. Some said the Pasha himself looked gaunt, as if drained by the emptiness he had tried to conquer. Ministers at court began to murmur as well. Kara Mustafa no longer held the same favor. Rivals circled, sensing weakness. Then the fall came swiftly. Stripped of his post, he was cast aside by the very empire that had once celebrated his union. Soon after, he was gone altogether, dead by illness or perhaps by decree. The records remain unclear, but what mattered to Fatma was the silence that followed. The heavy footsteps that had haunted her halls were no more. For the first time, she lifted her head and allowed herself to breathe. She thought perhaps freedom had come at last. As a widow, she might remain in Topkapi, live in the shadow of her sisters, untouched by another bridal procession. She sat by a window watching the garden sway in the wind and believed the nightmare might have ended. That hope lasted only until her mother appeared. Kösem Sultan entered the chamber dressed not in mourning, but in the robes of command. No grief marked her eyes. Her words were calm, cold, absolute. Another marriage had been arranged. Fatma would wed again. The illusion of freedom collapsed. Fatma lowered her gaze, not in obedience but in despair. She knew now that the cycle would never end. Her soul had died in the academy. Her body had died on her wedding night. And now her dignity would die too, as she was paraded once more through the streets as a coin spent by her mother's hand. The drums would sound again. The treasury would bleed again. And the daughter of Kösem Sultan understood at last that death itself would be kinder than the endless life of a bride who could never escape her veil. Years passed. And with every wedding, Fatma Sultan changed. The girl who had once been trained to kneel in silence and smile before a mirror no longer existed. The rituals had stripped her, broken her, remade her, until nothing remained but fury. What had been buried beneath layers of silk began to claw its way back to the surface. Fatma no longer obeyed. She no longer wore the mask. She had become something the Academy had never prepared for. A woman who fought her prison not with swords, but with words that cut sharper than steel. Her marriage to Malek Ahmed Pasha revealed the full force of this transformation. He was Grand Vizier, the highest servant of the empire, a man of strategy and power. To the court, it seemed a union designed to strengthen the dynasty. To Fatma, it was another sentence, but she would not accept it quietly. The stillness that had once defined her was gone. In its place lived defiance. At first it showed in small rebellions. She refused to lower her eyes when he entered the chamber. She laughed bitterly when he attempted to command her. She spoke with venom in private, telling him he was unworthy of a daughter of the House of Osman. Servants whispered that Fatma cursed him to his face, that her words turned his cheeks red with humiliation. What began as defiance soon became open contempt. The climax came during a gathering of ministers in the palace. The chamber was filled with the empire's highest officials. Malek Ahmed Pasha sat among them, his authority unquestioned. Then Fatma entered, draped in silk. She moved with the bearing of a queen, but her eyes blazed with something darker. She did not bow. She did not smile. Instead, she stepped before the assembly and unleashed her voice. She called her husband incompetent. She said he was unfit to rule the empire's armies, unfit even to share her chamber. Her words rang through the hall like blows. Ministers froze, stunned that the daughter of a sultan would strip her husband of dignity in front of them all. Malek Ahmed sat silent, his face ashen. The Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire had been unmade by the tongue of his wife. News spread quickly. Some whispered that she had gone mad. Others said she had finally revealed the truth about a man who was weaker than he seemed. What no one could deny was that Fatma had shattered every rule the Academy had drilled into her. A bride was meant to endure in silence. She had chosen to fight with rage. Yet her rebellion was not victory. It was collapse. Fatma's outburst revealed a woman consumed by the very system that had created her. She was no longer the quiet child who once recited poetry in the gardens. She was the echo of her mother, Kösem Sultan, whose power had been carved from the same suffering. Fatma hated her mother for it. Yet in every furious word, she became more like her. The court looked on in horror, seeing in Fatma not simply a woman lashing out, but the product of the empire itself. She was a mirror reflecting the cruelty of a system that turned daughters into coins, brides into prisoners, wives into weapons. And in that mirror, the ministers saw not only Fatma's ruin, but the shadow of Kösem herself, looming over them still. Fatma had broken free of silence. But what rose in its place was not freedom. It was a storm that consumed her dignity and left only the ashes of what she might have been. After the scandal with Malek Ahmed Pasha, Fatma Sultan did not find release. Her outburst before the court had shocked the empire. Yet it did not end the cycle. It only stained her name further. Ministers muttered that she was uncontrollable. Yet still, the dynasty used her body to forge new ties. A princess could not simply vanish into silence. She would marry again. The years pressed forward, and with each new husband, Fatma felt herself hollow further. In middle age, when other women settled into the quiet of family, she was once again lifted into a carriage, wrapped in silks, paraded through the streets. People did not cheer as they once had. Some pitied. Others mocked. She was no longer the radiant daughter of the empire. She was a reminder that even royalty could be stripped of dignity. Her third marriage was spoken of in whispers. The dowry poured from the treasury yet again, draining wealth that soldiers desperately needed. The procession was grand, but among the people the tone had changed. They no longer admired the jewels. They spoke instead of the curse of a woman doomed to repeat her own funeral disguised as a wedding. As years passed, age began to mark her face. Lines carved themselves into her skin. But the rituals never changed. She was still painted, perfumed, veiled in red as if time had not touched her. Attendants bound the familiar silk around her waist, ignoring the silver in her hair. The empire demanded its spectacle, and Fatma obeyed because she had no choice. Her later husbands were less eager than the first. They accepted her hand because the court demanded it, not because they desired her. In their eyes, she was not a bride, but a burden carrying the weight of Kösem's shadow. In her eyes, they were jailers, each taking a turn with the key. The more she aged, the more cruel the ceremonies became. To see a woman past her youth dressed in bridal finery was not majestic. It was grotesque. Yet the empire persisted. Each wedding was a declaration that her life belonged to the dynasty until the end. At night, she sat alone, staring into polished mirrors that once reflected her training smile. Now they showed a stranger. She thought of her mother, the woman she both hated and resembled. Kösem had endured the same walls, the same rituals, yet had emerged with power. Fatma had endured them and been reduced to dust. Perhaps this was the only difference between them. One became the architect, the other remained the sacrifice. By the time her hair had turned white, Fatma had walked down the aisle more times than memory could hold. Her name was tied not to a single husband, but to a chain of men, each linked by her suffering. She understood now that death would be the only veil she would not be forced to lift. Until then, the drums would call, the treasury would bleed, and she would march again as the endless bride of an empire without mercy. Fatma Sultan's death in 1670 did not erase the world that had consumed her. She was a single figure in a pattern that continued long after her body was lowered into the tomb. The Ottoman dynasty preserved its authority by repeating the same rituals that had shaped her life, and those rituals did not vanish with her. Official chronicles celebrated imperial weddings as proof of prosperity. They described jewels, silks, and the grandeur of processions through the streets of Istanbul. Yet they left unspoken the suffering of the women inside the veils. That silence is striking. It suggests not ignorance but intention, as if the empire itself wished to bury the cries of its daughters beneath the music of celebration. Foreign travelers who visited the Ottoman court during the 17th and 18th centuries provided fragments that pierced through this silence. Ambassadors from Venice, envoys from France, and English observers like Paul Ricaud described ceremonies that seemed dazzling yet disturbing. They noticed the strict training of brides, the weight of customs that reduced them to symbols, and the way marriage functioned less as union than as political exchange. Their accounts did not dwell on the inner pain of the women, but their unease was clear. They saw power disguised as ritual. These practices endured well into the 18th century. Ottoman princesses continued to be married again and again to governors and viziers, often against their will. The treasury was forced to supply dowries for each match, draining resources while the brides themselves became shadows of politics. The rituals of preparation and the public parades persisted, repeating across generations like a cycle that no one dared interrupt. Only with the gradual decline of dynastic marriages in the late 18th century did the practice begin to fade. By then, countless lives had already been consumed. The scarcity of direct records is telling. We have chronicles that praise the spectacle, yet few voices that describe the cost. Most of what we know comes from hints in memoirs, fragments in correspondence, or the whispers carried by servants and soldiers. This absence in the official record is itself a form of testimony. It reveals how carefully the empire polished its image while leaving its women invisible. Fatma's story survives because it encapsulates this larger silence. Her life is remembered not for victories or influence, but for the endless repetition of ceremonies that stripped her of freedom. In her, we see the shape of a tradition that outlived her by more than a century. To reflect on her is to ask what value tradition holds when it demands the slow destruction of those who endure it. Fatma's life shows that ceremony can become cruelty, and that cruelty can be preserved in the name of power. This is why her name echoes today. It reminds us that beneath every crown lies a story of those who bore its weight in silence. If you wish to continue uncovering these hidden stories, stay with us and subscribe to Out Channel.